Julian McNeil didn't believe in paranoia, at least not the kind whispered about in news forums or buried in the corner of clickbait articles about corporate surveillance and deep state control. He believed in negligence, incompetence, poorly written policy, maybe a touch of quiet corruption in zoning departments and local governance, but not grand conspiracies. So when his wife suggested they move to a newly developed private residential community just north of Austin, a quiet, tree-lined grid of homes called Deerfield Range, he didn't hesitate. She said it was secure. She said the privacy was excellent. And most importantly, she said it was far from attention. Not hiding, just quiet. And that was enough. Julian ran a small design business remotely, mostly wood-based interiors for commercial offices and boutique hotels, sometimes a private client here and there. His time was his own. The Deerfield Range community promised full groundskeeping, off-grid power redundancy, private trash service, perimeter patrols, and zero political signage allowed, an actual clause in the residency contract. The price was steep, the application process intense, and the local board not exactly warm, but after the noise of Houston, the quiet tasted like freedom. Or so he thought. Leah had found the place through a contact she didn't talk about, and Julian had learned not to ask when she got that sharpness in her tone. Her resume said she was a corporate security consultant specializing in emergency protocols and internal compliance. That was vague enough, and she never elaborated. Julian didn't push. She wasn't evasive, just firm, unflappable. It was one of the reasons he fell for her. Even-tempered, clear-headed, and razor-sharp when it mattered. He used to joke that if the world fell apart, he'd follow her instructions without hesitation. He meant it. And at Deerfield, things went smoothly at first, almost too smoothly. The first few weeks were uneventful, even idyllic. The house was modern, minimal, set back against a line of trees with a small secondary structure tucked behind the main living area that Julian used as a workshop. The neighbors were friendly enough in passing, if strangely uniform in tone and demeanor, always just polite enough to make conversation seem unnecessary. No one asked where they moved from. No one offered personal stories. There were weekend barbecues and group walks organized by the so-called wellness coordinator, a thin woman named Cheryl who smiled too wide and remembered every resident's name but never once asked Leah a direct question. Julian brushed it off. Rich people weirdness, probably. HOA types. Or rather, this wasn't even a normal HOA. This was something else entirely. A private management entity called Norco Residential Operations, subcontracted by the land developer and by their own claim, independent of the county oversight due to a mutual jurisdiction waiver buried in the application terms. Leah had signed it all without blinking. Julian skimmed it, didn't like the language, but followed her lead. The first time things felt off was when the gatehouse called Leah directly, not Julian, to inform her that a package had arrived for secondary verification. When she asked what that meant, the man on the line responded, "Routine audit," and hung up. The package was never delivered, no follow-up. Julian chalked it up to some internal mix-up. Leah, however, was quiet for hours after, typing something on a private device she kept separate from their home Wi-Fi, a military-grade-looking laptop he'd only seen once before during the move. That night, she didn't sleep. Then came the incident at the mailbox. Julian had been cleaning out the gutters when he heard her voice go tight, controlled but cold. He looked down and saw her standing face-to-face with a man in a windbreaker marked Neighborhood Oversight Unit. It wasn't a police badge, and it wasn't a private security uniform either, just a laminated card on a carabiner that looked like it was printed from a template. Julian couldn't hear everything, but he caught enough. Something about needing to verify her registration status due to sub-level discrepancy in the residency algorithm. When Leah asked for specifics, the man hesitated, then smiled too late. "Just a technicality," he said. "You're in our system, but not under the right tier." Whatever that meant. She asked if he had paperwork. He said it was digital only, tied to a proprietary clearance tool. She asked who oversaw that. He said regional processing, and walked away like nothing happened. Julian climbed down the ladder and approached her. "What the hell was that?" he asked. She only muttered, "Testing, limits, or trying to intimidate." She looked not afraid, but disgusted, like someone finding a rusted wire in their salad. 2 days later, their trash service skipped their pickup. Julian called, got no answer. They drove the bag to the drop-off depot across the subdivision, only to find the gate locked and a new sign that read, "Access limited pending reevaluation of procedural clearance." There was no contact number, just a QR code that led to a page marked "Internal Only." When he brought it up to Cheryl during the next community brunch, she waved it off like pollen in the breeze. "Oh, you're fine, sweetheart. Sometimes the system flags a house by mistake. You're not the only ones." But they were. Leah's composure didn't crack, but her routine changed. She checked the security system every hour. She started disabling the smart fridge and speakers at night. One morning, Julian found her sitting in the garage with the car hood up, installing something small under the battery. She said it was a voltage monitor. He knew it wasn't, but he also knew better than to interrupt her when she was calibrating anything. Then came the inspection. 2 men arrived in an unmarked gray van with modular vests that weren't quite tactical but definitely not civilian. They said they were checking on roof drainage across the south perimeter homes. One of them had a clipboard with a blank form on it. When Julian asked for ID, one said, "Your management packet includes cooperative access terms. You've acknowledged it by residency." That phrase, "acknowledged by residency," hit something in Julian's chest like ice water. Leah said nothing the whole time, just watched them from the doorway with her arms folded. Her phone was recording from her pocket, he could tell by the angle of her stance. The men never stepped inside, but one of them paused before leaving and said to her quietly, "We've got you on file. Make sure you stay in your lane." His smile was completely dead behind the eyes. That night, Leah made a call from the woods behind the house, not from her regular phone. She pulled a flat satellite device from a sealed box in the floorboards of her studio. Julian watched her from the porch but didn't follow. She returned 45 minutes later and said, "We might have to leave earlier than we thought. If anything happens to me, go to the city, find a man named Madsen at the District 12 office. Don't go to local police. Don't go to anyone here." Julian wanted to ask questions, but her tone left no room for them. And then, as if trying to test how fast she would move, it happened. They came for her in the morning. A white SUV, no plates, idling outside the house at 7:13 a.m. 2 people stepped out, one of them that same dead-eyed man from the drainage inspection. The other was a large woman in a tan utility vest with sweat stains already forming under the collar. She held a folder labeled "Compliance Escalation." Julian stepped outside in sweatpants and a shirt, barefoot, coffee still in hand. "You need something?" he asked. The man just stared. The woman smiled. "We're here to escort Ms. McNeil to a voluntary assessment session regarding procedural irregularities. No need to be alarmed. Just a formality." Leah was behind him already, dressed, keys in hand, calm as rain. "Not today," she said. The woman took a step forward. "Ma'am, refusal to comply can result in temporary placement under neighborhood hold." Julian moved between them. "You're not taking her anywhere." The woman nodded to the man who reached for something on his belt, but Leah was already moving, slipping around the house without another word. Seconds later, Julian heard the back fence open. When they rushed around the side of the house, she was gone. The woods behind the property were dense but not impassable. The SUV backed up, turned without a word, and drove off. Not fast, not aggressive, just as if they'd be back. Julian stood alone on the lawn, heart hammering, wondering what the hell he'd just witnessed. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It wasn't a glitch in the system. Something had shifted, and Leah somehow had seen it coming all along. Julian stood in the kitchen long after the SUV disappeared down the main road, staring out the window into the tree line where his wife had vanished minutes earlier. The woods were silent, still glistening from the early morning dew, and the mist rising off the underbrush curled like smoke from an extinguished fire. He didn't call after her, didn't chase. She had told him clearly. If something like this happened, she'd handle it herself. And though every muscle in his body was screaming for action, to do something, to call someone, to go after her, a deeper part of him knew anything he did now could make it worse. She hadn't run because she was scared. She had evaded them with precision. That wasn't panic. That was execution. That was someone trained for exactly this. The next 3 hours were a blur. Julian waited, pacing the house like a trapped animal. He checked the back fence every 10 minutes, hoping to see her reappear from the shadows. Bloody, maybe. Disheveled. But alive, with that cold steel in her eyes. But the woods remained empty, and the silence began to feel like something more deliberate. He tried calling her phone, but it was off, disconnected entirely. Not even straight to voicemail. Just dead. He thought about leaving a message on the landline, but stopped himself. If someone was listening, he wouldn't give them more than they already had. By noon, he drove into the nearest town, Guthrie Junction, a small cluster of brick government buildings and strip malls about 15 minutes from Deerfield. The police department was in a low-slung municipal building next to a fitness center and a flagpole where the flag hung limp in the windless heat. Inside, the AC was humming loudly, almost drowning out the receptionist's voice. Julian approached the desk, asked to speak with a detective, any available investigator. The woman typed something, looked up with a rehearsed expression of polite disinterest, and told him someone would be out shortly. 25 minutes later, a young man in a dark blue shirt with a badge clipped to his belt emerged and introduced himself as Officer Wexley, not a detective, just responding officer. Julian explained the situation calmly but clearly. His wife had been approached by 2 individuals in an unmarked vehicle claiming to represent residential oversight. They attempted to forcibly escort her for compliance issues, and when she refused, she disappeared into the woods behind their property. He said the words plainly, without embellishment, but watched Wexley's face tighten in that subtle way people's expressions change when they're hearing something they know they can't or won't respond to. "Did you get a plate number?" the officer asked finally. "They didn't have one. No tags. The vehicle was unmarked." "Did they threaten you physically? Brandish a weapon?" "No, but one reached for something. It didn't get that far." Wexley nodded slowly, writing it all down on a notepad that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. "Unfortunately, if she left on her own and there was no assault or actual detainment attempt, we can't classify this as a kidnapping. Adults are allowed to leave if they choose." Julian exhaled through his nose, staring at the linoleum floor. "So, if 2 people show up trying to take my wife and she runs before they physically touch her, we just call that a Tuesday?" Wexley offered a sympathetic shrug, the kind trained into municipal responders over years of dull bureaucracy. "Unless you have proof of coercion or a direct threat, I can't file a report that'll go anywhere. You can file a missing person alert, but only after 48 hours unless there are signs of distress or vulnerability. Was she under any kind of psychiatric treatment? Medication?" Julian cut him off with a look that bordered on contempt. "She's the sharpest person you'll ever meet. Don't go down that road." The officer nodded again, not arguing but clearly looking to disengage. Julian filed the report anyway, just in case. He didn't expect anything to come of it, and by the time he stepped back into the blazing sun outside, he knew for certain. Local law enforcement was not going to help. He spent the rest of the day driving. Not aimlessly. He was looking for that SUV. Not because he thought he'd find it parked somewhere in plain view, but because his instincts told him they might be watching. He drove the perimeter of Deerfield Range twice, then took the back roads leading into the next sector of homes still under development. The further he drove, the more he noticed a pattern. Every few blocks, a black sedan sat parked near the edge of the sidewalk. Same make, different license plates, but they all had that same eerie posture, just far enough from the homes to not be suspicious, but too well placed to be idle. At one point, he pulled into a gas station and saw one of those sedans roll through the far end of the lot, its driver not stopping, not turning, just watching. He turned to face it directly, lifting his phone like he might take a photo. The car didn't slow, but its windows remained tinted, black as obsidian. It passed him like a shadow. Back home, the house felt sterile. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards under his feet, the click of the security system interface that had inexplicably reset to factory default. His cameras had been disabled again, and now the app requested administrator credentials he didn't have. It had been Leah's system, set up on her own devices. With her gone, the house was just an empty shell with a security grid he couldn't penetrate. At 8:07 p.m., the landline rang. No one ever called that number. He hadn't even thought to plug it in until Leah insisted they keep it connected, just in case. He answered on the third ring. "Julian," a voice said. Male, low, measured, no accent. "You need to leave the house, now." "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. Get in your car and drive to the post office on Lineker Avenue. There's a storage unit behind it. Use the code written inside your desk drawer. You'll find what you need there." "What's going on? Where's Leah?" "Stop asking questions. She gave you protocols for a reason. Execute them." The line went dead. Julian stood motionless for a moment, the receiver still pressed to his ear. The voice hadn't been threatening, but it hadn't sounded like someone used to being ignored. He walked straight to the desk in Leah's studio, pulled out the top drawer, and flipped over the foam liner beneath the pens and notebooks. There, written in small block letters on a strip of medical tape, was a 6-digit code. 30 minutes later, under cover of dusk, he parked behind the Lineker post office, behind the chain-link gate of an adjacent lot. The storage unit was small, gray, nondescript. The keypad lit up green after the second try, and the door slid open to reveal a single crate inside, military grade, reinforced. He cracked it open. Inside were 3 burner phones, a folder of documents labeled Transfer Package 3C, a flash drive, 2 sets of vehicle keys, and a note in Leah's handwriting. "If you're reading this, we've hit stage 2. Don't go back to the house. They're not local. They're private, and they're under contract. Do not assume law enforcement is unaware. They are not uninvolved. Find Madsen. Trust no one else." That night, Julian didn't sleep. He sat in a rented sedan parked in the back lot of a closed diner, watching the headlights pass along the highway, knowing with sick certainty that everything in his life, his home, his wife, his identity, was already under siege. The attack hadn't been physical, not yet, but that was never how it started. This wasn't random. It wasn't bureaucratic overreach. It was an extraction attempt. And whoever they were, they had made a mistake. They came for the wrong woman. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. But they were about to find out. The morning after Julian found the storage unit, the world looked different. Not in the sense of some cinematic shift where the colors changed or the light dimmed, but in the deeper, more insidious way that settles into a man's bones when he realizes that the foundation beneath his life is no longer made of concrete or trust or legality. It's made of silence, of systems built without oversight, of eyes watching from behind mirrored glass. He hadn't slept. His mind was too full, trying to piece together a picture with only the corners of the puzzle visible. He had Leah's note, the burner phones, the flash drive, and the name, Madsen. That was the only thread, and so he did what Leah told him to do. He moved. Julian spent that day erasing his own footprint. He emptied their bank accounts in small amounts across multiple ATMs, leaving the rest to trigger alerts on purpose. If they were watching transactions, he wanted them to notice. He ditched his phone, his real one, by leaving it under the bench of a crowded train platform set to airplane mode. He picked up one of the burner phones and powered it on only for 30 seconds before turning it off again. A pulse, a breadcrumb, something for Leah to find if she was tracking. He paid cash for gas, avoided cameras, changed his route twice. Every time he stopped at a red light, he checked the rearview mirror for the same sedan. And, more than once, it was there. Not the same one, exactly. Different makes, different colors, but always the same pattern. No stickers, no visible registration, slightly tinted glass, and drivers who looked forward even when the car was stopped. They didn't turn to check their phones, didn't adjust the radio, didn't show any of the little human quirks you expect from someone sitting in a car. These weren't bored commuters. These were watchers. That evening, Julian reached the city center and made his way to the District 12 office building. It was an older, municipal structure built in the 70s, with dull cement walls and a cramped parking lot half filled with government vehicles. No one stopped him as he entered. No metal detectors, no front desk security, just a sign-in sheet on a clipboard that no one seemed to look at. He found the third floor, walked past the rows of cubicles and looked for the name. Madsen. There wasn't a plaque, no office door. But one of the interns, barely older than 20, caught his eye and asked, "You here for the vetting?" Julian blinked, nodded, and followed the kid through a service hallway and into a records room that smelled of stale air and metal file cabinets. There, behind a second false wall lined with archival boxes, was a door marked with a black magnet card reader and no visible label. The kid knocked twice, then said, "Drop in, sir. He's not on the list." The door clicked open from the inside. Madsen was not what Julian expected. He was maybe 55, lean, dressed in a mechanic's coverall under a wool coat, with a week-old beard and eyes like he hadn't blinked since Reagan left office. He didn't say hello. He didn't shake hands. He closed the door behind Julian, sat at the far side of a table, and said, "If she gave you my name, that means we're fucked. Sit down." Julian obeyed. What followed was not a conversation. It was a debriefing. Madsen already knew Leah's name, her assignment designation, the structure of the private contractor she'd infiltrated, and the geographic clusters that had already gone dark. "These people you're dealing with," he said, "they're not rogue. They're structured. And they've got clearance levels higher than local law enforcement. That's why the cops wouldn't help you. Half of them are paid to ignore. The other half are afraid to ask." Julian tried to absorb it, but his head was spinning. What the hell are they trying to do? They call it a behavioral filtration project. Started out as a zoning initiative to predict resident satisfaction. Then someone got smart and folded in data acquisition. Imagine a gated community, but the gate is psychological. The goal is to identify outliers, people who don't conform, don't participate in the communal feedback loop. Once they find them, they're isolated, observed, reconditioned if possible. If not, they disappear. Julian couldn't believe what he was hearing, but part of him already had. And Leah? Leah was inserted to disrupt their data collection and trace their funding. She wasn't supposed to make contact with a node, meaning you. They flagged you early because you weren't compliant, you asked too many questions, didn't join the barbecues. Your house was already under active surveillance before she even tripped the trigger. Julian felt cold wash through his gut. They tried to take her. They didn't try, Madsen said flatly. They failed. That's not the same thing. Julian gave him the flash drive. Madsen plugged it into a standalone terminal, one clearly disconnected from any network, and began scrolling. He grunted once, maybe in approval, maybe in dread. She got deep, deeper than anyone we've sent in. These files, some of them aren't even supposed to exist. Employee rosters, procurement logs, internal comms. This is enough to bury a dozen contracts. Julian leaned forward. So, what do? We do nothing. You vanish. I send this up the chain, and we hope they're not fast enough to wipe her before the agency traces the breach. No, Julian said, his voice firm. I'm not leaving. Madsen looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. Then you'll need protection. Over the next 48 hours, Julian disappeared from public life. Madsen gave him a new ID, new bank credentials, a new residence in a neutral zone, a property owned by a shell company, not registered under his name, monitored only by one internal agency team with no civilian oversight. Julian moved in, set up a routine, and waited. The days passed slowly, each one more suffocating than the last, and Leah remained silent. Her devices went cold. No signals, no pings, nothing. Then, one morning, the mailbox outside his safe house contained a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single item, a parking stub from a deck in downtown Austin, time-stamped for 3:42 a.m., 2 nights prior. Julian didn't hesitate. He drove there, parked on the 3rd floor, and began scanning the surrounding area. At first, nothing. Then, tucked behind a vent pipe, he found it. A second envelope, sealed in plastic, wedged under a concrete ledge. Inside was a photo. It showed a blurred image of a woman walking across a parking structure, head down, hood up. But even through the low resolution, Julian could see the gait, the posture, the way she carried her right shoulder slightly back to favor the joint. It was Leah. She was alive, but she was in hiding, on the run, or worse, bait. As Julian drove back, his mind was a hornet's nest. This was her signal, but it was also a test. If he'd followed it recklessly, he might have led them straight to her. If he ignored it, he might miss his only chance. It was classic protocol. Trace the asset, confirm their mobility, but don't initiate contact until instructed. He didn't sleep that night. The burner phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. It was a single message. Eyes everywhere. Pull back. I'm not done yet. L. Julian read it twice, then burned the phone in the fire pit outside. By the end of that week, he was no longer just a civilian caught in the crossfire. He was now part of the operation. And the rules had changed. The week that followed was like walking through a mirror version of life, where everything looked real but nothing felt right. Julian kept to the script, rotating safe houses, using burner phones only when absolutely necessary, monitoring news wires and encrypted channels that Madsen granted him temporary access to, and, above all else, waiting for the next breadcrumb from Leah. She had gone dark again since her last message, and although he knew it was protocol, controlled silence, minimal exposure, temporary dead zones, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was moving faster than he could track. Something was shifting. He could feel it in the silence between each cautious step, in the way the cars outside his window would sometimes pause a fraction too long at the curb, or how the lights in the apartment above his flickered in a pattern that matched no electrical rhythm he recognized. The enemy wasn't watching him from a distance anymore. They were circling in close, sniffing around the perimeter, waiting to see if he would break cover. The next signal came not through digital means, but tactile. A letter, again in a manila envelope, this time slipped between the slats of his mailbox rather than delivered inside it. No postage, no stamp, just his name handwritten in black marker. Inside, a single photograph. Leah, standing outside what looked like a residential trailer near the outskirts of a commercial district he didn't recognize. The timestamp, embedded subtly in the lower right corner, told him everything he needed to know. She was alive, and she was letting him know it hadn't been long. He studied the background, the graffiti on the dumpster behind her, the angle of the shadows, the partial sign above the rusted fence line. She wasn't sending a location. She was sending a message. I'm still mobile, and I've breached their lair. Julian decoded the graffiti symbol using one of Madsen's old field tools, a lexicon of informal symbols used by transients, field agents, and in some circles, paramilitary off-gridders. The tag translated loosely to unmonitored zone, transitory shelter. That meant she had found a pocket of land where surveillance density was low, either due to technological interference or legal ambiguity. He relayed the image through the secure channel Madsen had shown him, attaching his analysis and requesting a vector trace, but received no response. It was the first time Madsen had failed to acknowledge his message. That absence hit harder than he expected. Madsen was a creature of control, of check-ins and redundancies. For him to go silent either meant he was compromised, or that he knew something Julian didn't and needed him to stay uninformed. Hours turned into a day. Julian used the time to re-examine the flash drive Leah had left him. He hadn't explored every folder initially, trusting Madsen to parse the bulk of it. But something tugged at him, a sense that maybe there was something personal left behind for him, something she couldn't say directly. One folder stood out. It was mislabeled, an innocuous string of numbers that didn't match the formatting of the rest. Inside were 6 video files, all under 30 seconds. Surveillance footage, not of public spaces, not of target installations, but of homes. Ordinary suburban homes just like the one they had shared. In each video, the same white SUV appeared. Same angles, same approach, same 2-person team. 1 male, 1 female. The woman matched the build and posture of the one who had tried to take Leah. In one video, she could be seen walking up to the door, knocking 3 times, then stepping aside to let the male enter. Less than a minute later, the front door would close and the video would cut. No one ever came out. No one was ever seen resisting. In the final clip, Julian saw something that turned his stomach. It was their house. Before they moved in, he watched the vehicle pull up, watched the man enter, watched a figure, possibly the previous tenant, resist. There was a struggle. The footage cut mid-motion, but before it did, he saw the woman step inside, close the door, and turn to the camera. Not directly, not breaking the fourth wall, but she moved in such a way that he could see her face clearly in the frame. And she was smiling. It wasn't just about extraction. It was a system of erasure, designed not only to remove people but to rewrite the narrative around them, to make their disappearance seem clean, voluntary, or unimportant. Julian sat in the dark with the screen glowing in front of him, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles ached. This wasn't about Leah anymore. It was about everyone who had vanished before her, everyone flagged as non-compliant, inconvenient, too questioning. It was about the way entire neighborhoods could be turned into holding pens, with contracts disguised as residency agreements and security patrols operating without oversight under the veil of private governance. He could no longer pretend this was a glitch in the system or a few bad actors abusing their reach. This was systemic. It was funded. And, worst of all, it was working. When Madsen finally did make contact, it wasn't through the secure channel. It was in person. Julian returned to his apartment after a short perimeter sweep, standard by now, and found the lights already on, the lock untouched. Madsen was seated at the dining table, coat off, hands folded. He looked tired. His left eye was bruised. No explanation was offered. "They're moving faster than we expected," he said. "2 of our shell safe houses were compromised this morning. No physical breach, but the infrastructure's been flagged. Leah's no longer just a surveillance target. She's been classified as a disruption vector." "What does that mean?" Julian asked, though he already knew. "It means they've greenlit lethal authorization in case of active encounter." Julian wanted to break something, scream, punch the wall, anything, but the weight of it sat too heavy on him. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "Where is she?" "She's in the District 9 recovery grid, about 20 miles outside city limits. We don't know the exact coordinates, but she's in motion, moving between nodes, staying dark. Likely, she's looking for a backdoor into their core relay. She can't do it alone. No, she can't. That's why I'm here. Madsen slid an old black duffel bag across the table. Inside was a transponder, a full-spectrum scanner, and a signal booster capable of disrupting local surveillance feeds for up to 90 seconds. Just enough time to move. Not enough time to think. You'll need to act like a civilian, Madsen said. No heroics. Just follow her trail, use the booster if she gives the go signal, and stay invisible. If you're spotted, you'll compromise both of you. If that happens, you disappear. Not run. Vanish. Julian nodded slowly, the gravity settling on his chest like an anchor. There was no cavalry coming, no dramatic rescue, just two people outflanking a system that didn't recognize them as human variables. Just data. Just noise. And now they were going to become the glitch that crashed the program. Julian didn't sleep the night Madsen gave him the transponder. He lay on the edge of the mattress in that sterile apartment, clothes on, eyes fixed to the dark ceiling as the hum of the city filtered in through half-closed blinds. There were no answers up there, only the weight of calculation. How long before Leah sent another signal? How much time they had before the grid closed around them? How deep this entire structure really went? He knew that at this point they weren't simply dealing with privatized enforcement or rogue surveillance. The operations Leah had penetrated were part of a network, coordinated, protected not just by local corruption, but by embedded protocols in finance, zoning, and public infrastructure. And now that Leah had pierced their core archive, now that they knew she wasn't just a resistant civilian, but a trained field asset, they'd rewritten her status. She was no longer a threat to control. She was a threat to exposure. The next day, he left early. Dressed like any middle-aged contractor, cargo pants, work boots, plain hoodie, baseball cap pulled low, he blended in with the weekday crowd. Madsen's instructions had been surgical. Travel south, stay off interstates, rotate transport. In a rest area just past county lines, Julian retrieved a prepaid motorcycle key from inside a taped compartment beneath the sink in the men's restroom. The bike was parked at the rear of a storage facility, under a cover tagged for scrap. He stripped it clean, checked the tires, the ignition, the brake line. Someone had already prepped it. Someone Madsen trusted, or someone he had no choice but to. Julian didn't like either option. The coordinates burned into his memory pointed him toward the outer ring of a failed urban development, one of those government-funded resilience housing zones that had gone bankrupt midway through construction and now stood as hollowed shells in the scrubland, half-poured foundations, scaffold skeletons, and modular walls abandoned before drywall. It was here that Julian first spotted the marker, spray paint across a discarded cement mixer, the same coded symbol Leah had used before. He killed the engine, rolled the bike behind a collapsed fence, and made his approach on foot. No one watched from windows. There were none. No patrols, no movement. Just heat and stillness and wind across dead ground. Then, in the shadow of a derelict prefab structure, he saw her. Not Leah. A boy. No, older than 15. Barefoot, sunburned, holding a pair of binoculars and chewing on sunflower seeds like he'd been born waiting for something. He didn't run when Julian approached, didn't speak, just handed him a piece of paper and pointed north. Then he vanished back into the metal forest like a ghost. The paper held nothing but a string of characters, handwritten. Julian scanned it twice. It was a key, a cipher line, likely an unlock code for one of Leah's dead drops. He moved slowly. No rush, no sudden movements. He was being watched. He could feel it. Not from cameras, those were obvious, detectable, but from something older, more human. Someone was waiting to see what he'd do next. So he did what Leah would do. He walked to the edge of the construction zone, waited precisely 6 minutes, then stepped into a concrete basin shaped like a half-built swimming pool. There, under a loose drainage panel, was a secure case. Inside, an encrypted radio, a thermal map of a nearby power relay station, and a burner phone sealed in foil. The screen blinked once when activated. "They've gone mobile. Relay breach successful. Limited window. Need visual confirmation. Park lot 76C. 8 p.m. That was Leah. No signature, but it was her. Julian made his way back to the motorcycle, now completely exposed under the sun, and rode west. He passed checkpoints he didn't recognize. Trucks parked on the shoulders, workers in uniforms with no insignias, radio antennas that didn't match any cell providers. These weren't civilian installations. He avoided their eyes, took the long way, cut through service lanes, and reached 76C, a broken slab of asphalt outside an abandoned community rec center. No vehicles, just a single utility van, white, streaked with red clay. He parked across the street, killed the engine, waited. At 8:02, the side door of the van slid open and a figure stepped out. Not Leah. A woman, tall, heavy-set, wearing the same tan utility vest he'd seen once before. Karen. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Her hair was tied back tight, her stance wide, balanced. She was scanning, not for threats, but for witnesses. She opened the rear of the van. Julian's stomach dropped. Inside he saw wires, screens, a chair bolted to the floor, not a transport vehicle, an extraction cell, mobile. And then he saw her, not in the van, on the roof. Leah. Flat, prone, eyes locked through a scope, a rifle, silenced. Trained not on Karen, but the corner of the lot where a black SUV had just crept into view. Julian remained frozen, hands on the gas tank, unsure if he was part of the plan or an exposed flank. His burner buzzed once. New message. Do not engage. Intercept planned. Stay eyes on. If signal lost, initiate burn. At 8:09, the SUV's back doors opened. 2 men stepped out. Identical posture, mismatched IDs on lanyards, not speaking. They approached Karen. She opened a tablet, handed it to them. One of the men pointed toward the rec center. Karen shook her head. They argued. Then one raised his arm. The signal. Leah fired. The shot cracked through the stillness like a whip, barely audible, but the reaction was immediate. The man dropped. The second lunged toward the SUV, screaming into a headset. Karen ducked, rolled behind the van, drew a sidearm, but Julian was already moving. He gunned the bike across the lot, swerving into the open rear door of the van, knocking the other open with the front tire. It collapsed onto its side. He slid off, rolled, pulled the transponder from his jacket, jammed it into the dashboard. 90 seconds of scrambled comms. Leah dropped off the roof, landed hard, rifle already collapsed into her back rig. They didn't speak, just moved. Karen tried to block the exit. Leah hit her with the butt of the rifle. Sharp, precise. No wasted movement. Karen dropped like a felled tree. Julian pulled Leah into the SUV, hot-wired it in under 10 seconds while she rerouted the tracking feed with a handheld jammer. They drove blind, no lights, no GPS, across state lines before sunrise. They ditched the vehicle in a quarry, ignited the seats with alcohol-soaked rags, and walked for half a mile until they reached a gas station where an old man named Ramon gave them a ride to a ranch no one knew existed. It was there, finally, that Leah spoke. They weren't just trying to capture us. They were closing the program. It's a full wipe now. Julian leaned against the wall, heart still thundering. How many more like us? She didn't answer immediately, just stared out the window. Too many. Now they weren't just surviving. They were hunting. The next 72 hours unfolded with the clarity and finality of a closing trap. The kind you sense before you feel, the pressure in the air shifting, the tone of the landscape narrowing like a funnel. Julian and Leah moved quickly, but not recklessly. Every mile they gained, every intersection crossed under false tags and disguised vehicles, was part of a broader geometry Leah had already calculated in her head. This wasn't panic, this wasn't reaction. It was convergence. She had known from the moment she breached the relay station that there would be a threshold, a point of no return, and they had passed it back at the parking lot when Karen appeared with the mobile extraction unit. That hadn't been a retrieval mission, it had been a sweep. Not for Leah. For everything. They weren't being hunted anymore. They were the last variables to neutralize before the next phase of something larger rolled into motion. Julian could see it in her silence, the way she spoke less now, saved every word for necessity, moving through safe houses with that same internal map she'd been building since the day they arrived at Deerfield. They reached the final location under cover of night, a decommissioned freight terminal buried in a stretch of dead land outside an old airfield, long since disconnected from any official registry. Leah had called it an old fire zone, meaning once it had been burned, literally and operationally, and now was presumed dead by every contractor, agency, and algorithm scraping surface data. That was exactly what they needed. Inside, hidden beneath rows of rusting shipping containers and overturned pallets, they found the hub, a narrow underground passage that opened into a command node once used for monitoring cargo routes. Now it served as a dead-letter drop for independent operators who didn't want to be seen. Here, Leah unrolled the last physical copy of what she called the recovery map, an interconnected diagram of every known surveillance relay node, server cluster, and mobility corridor used by the contractor overseeing the behavioral filtration zones. It stretched across 9 states. At least 17 operational communities were still active, some in the early stages, some years into full isolation and resident rewriting. Julian didn't want to know how many families were inside, how many people believed they were living normal suburban lives while their behaviors were being parsed and adjusted in real time. The worst part was, Leah said, they weren't even the first model. This version, what she and Madsen had flagged as Tier 3, was the sustainable model, designed for replication and low-profile deployment. "We don't have time to stop it at the top," Leah said finally, crouched over the diagram with a red marker between her fingers. "They've already buried the paper trail, rerouted funding, decentralized the legal liability. The only way to break this isn't through law or exposure, it's by forcing a fail condition." "How?" Julian asked, already knowing the answer would cost something. "By making them break their own system in real time, making them panic, making them activate protocols that weren't meant to be seen." She pointed to 3 nodes on the map, all connected to a central relay facility marked only by coordinates, rural, unregistered, hidden within a commercial greenhouse complex used as a shell corporation. That was the heart of the operation. Not where the decisions were made, but where the data converged. Every extracted subject, every live analysis feed, every real-time compliance trigger, it all funneled through that center. "We don't leak the documents," Leah said. "We burn the relay while it's running. They'll flood every system trying to isolate the breach, and in doing so, they'll expose their distribution methods, their partners, their funding web. And then the real agencies pick up the signal, the ones even they don't know about." Julian nodded slowly. "And we just walk in?" Leah gave a small, tired smile. "Not quite. We get invited." The next day, they initiated the bait sequence. Using a scrambled packet lifted from the recovery map, Leah sent out a fabricated compliance breach code, a signal designed to mimic the behavioral signatures of a resident undergoing psychotic decompensation, the kind that would trigger an emergency. Wellness response in Tier 3 zones. She routed it through 3 abandoned parcels still marked as active, layered with Julian's ID tags and telemetry from their time in Deerfield. Within minutes, the system responded. A black van rolled out of an intake depot an hour later. Another team activated in a neighboring district. They were being triangulated, deliberately corralled. Leah let them close the net. They met the team at an off-grid fuel depot. Leah wore a transmitter collar programmed to register her as a recovered subject in mid-stabilization. Julian posed as an embedded assessor from the community board. They didn't speak more than necessary. The extraction team didn't ask questions. Why would they? Their systems confirmed every false credential. The trust was in the data, not the people. That was their weakness. They were driven to the greenhouse compound just before nightfall. The exterior looked like any other agricultural outpost. Rows of synthetic plastic tunnels, small tractors, irrigation lines. But beneath it, Julian saw the truth. Magnetic doors, iris scanners, hallways with no windows. Every room painted in neutral tones, every corner slightly curved, eliminating hard angles, reducing tension. The architecture wasn't accidental. It was designed to suppress resistance before it began. A human maze wrapped in the skin of peace. They were led to a chamber marked Conformance Zone 6. Inside, a single operator sat at a terminal wall, dozens of feeds flickering. Residential streets, living rooms, cars, yards. Each screen marked with a code, none with names. The operator turned, bored, barely looking at them. Assessment team? Julian nodded. Leah handed over a falsified scan pad. The man glanced, barely verifying. Basement sectors are mid-sequence. Don't touch anything marked with orange tags. The uplink will spike in 15. That was the signal. Leah stepped behind him, reached into her waistband and drove the transponder spike through the main relay. It pierced the housing with a hiss. Julian slammed the lockdown switch on the wall. Doors sealed. Sirens flickered but didn't sound. Silent protocols. Leah triggered the overload. Every camera on the wall stuttered. Feed distortion. Redirection. Julian activated the signal fork, pushing the cascade into the routing servers. Within seconds, the system tried to compensate. Backup kicked in. Internal processes fought for clarity. And then the core system did what Leah had bet it would. It initiated breach lockdown, sent its full infrastructure report upstream for emergency audit. That was the crack. The window. Outside, power cut. Not by Leah. Not by them. From the distance, a pulse rippled. A white noise frequency that shut the entire uplink down. Someone else was watching. Someone else was waiting. And they had just shown their hand. Leah turned to Julian. "We're done here." They moved before anyone could stop them, through a maintenance shaft Leah had marked on the schematics, out into the fields behind the compound. By the time the recovery teams arrived, the data was already in motion, sent through 4 mirrored nodes to servers Leah didn't control and couldn't trace. It wasn't about possession anymore. It was about exposure. And now it had begun. They didn't go back to the safe house. That had never been the plan. Once the uplink spike was sent and the signal forked through the auxiliary mirrors, they vanished into terrain Leah had pre-mapped years ago for reasons she'd never explained, but now made perfect sense. A fallback zone, neutral, off-grid, geo-fenced by topography rather than code. No towers, no relays, no roads. Just dry hills, old radio towers, and a weather station from the 60s that still stood like a skeleton on the ridge. That's where they waited. For hours. Then a full day. They moved twice, once on foot, once by a vehicle Leah pulled from a culvert 5 miles east. It was preloaded with essentials: water, rations, pre-rigged papers, a sat map with only 3 marked destinations, and a single envelope labeled IF. Julian didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. Whatever came next would come without warning. By the end of the second night, the first pulse came through the secure channel, a stripped, encrypted header pushed across a legacy relay. One Leah had told Madsen to watch, but not use. It was short, raw, nearly shredded by compression, but the key phrase got through. Tier 3 collapsed, internal review, extraction log dumped, targets compromised, asset flagged, burned. No source, no reply. But it said enough. The relay they had broken wasn't just a server. It was a convergence point for every active phase of the behavioral filtration program. And once its core began hemorrhaging live telemetry, the entire network panicked. Contingency layers kicked in. Some tried to isolate the breach. Others triggered overcorrection protocols, activating the exact systems designed to remain silent. In trying to erase the mistake, they broadcasted it. And once that data hit the external shells Leah had infected earlier in the campaign, it went further, beyond contractor range, beyond privatized firewalls. It reached ears not supposed to hear it. Intelligence nodes outside domestic oversight. The kind that didn't send lawyers, the kind that sent planes with no tail numbers and people who didn't carry phones. Julian watched Leah process it in real time. Not relief, not triumph, calculation. She didn't smile. She simply started organizing what came next, burning the last of the files they no longer needed, destroying transmitters, wiping drives with acid kits. She moved like a closing chapter, precise and permanent. By sunrise, they were packed, standing near the edge of the ridge, wind cutting across the empty valley below them, and he knew what was about to happen before she spoke. "I have to disappear now." He didn't argue. There was no plea, no dramatic pause. He just looked at her, memorizing the lines of her face, the cadence of her breathing, the way she scanned the horizon, not for threat, but for clarity. She handed him a second envelope, this one unlabeled. Inside, a key, plain metal, no markings. He asked nothing. She nodded once, not for him, but for something behind him. A signal. He turned. A man stood 30 feet away. No vehicle. Just presence. Neutral expression. The kind of presence trained to be ignored. Leah walked past Julian without turning. As she reached the man, she paused once. "Keep your head down for 6 months, then use the key." And she was gone. Julian didn't follow. He stayed on that ridge until the sun climbed high enough to burn shadows from the rocks, then walked back to the outpost and waited. No one came. No messages. No sudden sirens or dark vehicles on the horizon. Just wind and time and memory. Weeks passed. He moved twice more. Took up a name Leah had pre-registered for him, complete with a fabricated work history, verified address, even a dental record. He found a small mechanic's garage near a freight junction, worked under a man who asked no questions and spoke even fewer words. It suited him. At night he read books Leah had once stored in a silent locker, manuals, field journals, even poetry in the margins of an old technical digest. Each one marked in small red symbols only he and she would understand. One evening, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, only a photo. Not of her, of Karen. Sitting on a courthouse bench, disheveled, wild-eyed, flanked by men in civilian suits trying to hold her still as a local news team shouted for comment. The headline read nothing, just a date. The rest had been scrubbed. But Julian knew what it meant. The walls had cracked. Someone had leaked something, and someone was trying to contain it with the old methods. Discredit, reassign, deny. But denial didn't work when the files were already gone. When the truth had already crossed oceans on flash drives no one could trace. Another 6 months passed. On the day Leah's timeline ended, Julian found himself standing in front of a storage unit, using the key she had given him. The lock clicked like a whisper. Inside, darkness. Then a light flickered to life. A screen glowed on the wall. A single message appeared. That wasn't the end, just their first mistake. No name, but he smiled. the first in months. Then another message appeared beneath it. Ready for Phase 2. He reached for the keyboard. He typed, "Always."